She insulted a regular customer only to realize he owned the place and was Clint Eastwood. The midday sun streamed through the wide windows of Sierra Grill, a lively yet modest restaurant in Carmel by the Sea, California. It wasn't a luxury establishment, but it had a charm of its own, part rustic, part modern. A local favorite, especially on a warm Thursday afternoon. For Megan, a 23-year-old waitress barely scraping by, charm wasn't enough to ease her frustration. Her shift had been a disaster from the moment she clocked in. "Table 7 needs extra dressing," called a coworker. Megan didn't even glance up as she scribbled another order onto her notepad. Her ponytail swayed as she moved briskly between tables, juggling complaints about overcooked steaks, splitting checks, and missing drink orders. To make matters worse, 3 differ, and customers had stiffed her in tips in the past hour, leaving her nothing but a handful of coins. By the time an elderly man in his 80s wandered in and quietly settled at a corner table, Megan was already in a foul mood. He didn't look like someone who cared much for appearances. A slightly wrinkled flannel shirt, faded jeans, and a worn Stetson resting beside him. His boots had clearly seen years of dusty roads. Megan took one look at him, her lips curling in mild irritation. "Great," she mumbled under her breath. "Another one who'll order coffee and leave me $1. But she couldn't ignore him forever. A coworker nudged her, whispering, "You've got table 12. Megan sighed, grabbed her notepad, and forced on her well-practiced smile as she made her way over. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her voice tinged with impatience. The man glanced up, his sharp eyes studying her for a moment. Something about him felt oddly familiar, but Megan couldn't quite place it. "Just a burger," he said, his voice deep and slightly gravelly. It carried a quiet authority, as though it demanded respect without even trying. "Burger, got it. Anything else?" Megan asked, tapping her pen on the notepad. "No, ma'am." He tipped his hat slightly. She rolled her eyes as she turned away, muttering, "Mom, really?" under her breath. Still, as she entered the kitchen, she couldn't shake a strange feeling. Unlike the usual rude, demanding, or dismissive customers, this man was different. There was something about his presence, a quiet confidence, as if he was watching and waiting for something. Megan shook it off. Just another table, another order, another $1, nothing more. Or so she thought. A few minutes later, Megan returned with his burger, setting the plate down with less care than usual. She was running on fumes. Her patience stretched thin. "Here you go," she said, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face as she placed a ketchup bottle beside his plate. "Anything else?" The man studied the burger, then glanced up. "No, this looks just fine. Thank you." His words were polite, but there was a firmness in his tone that made McGann feel oddly self-conscious. She hesitated, uncertain why she hadn't moved to the next table yet. Something about his unshakable composure irritated her. Everyone else in the restaurant was either complaining, snapping their fingers, or hurrying around in a frenzy, but not him. "You're not from around here, are you?" She leaned against the table, unable to help herself. "No, I'm not," he said simply, slicing his burger in half with precise, deliberate movements. "Thought so," she replied with a smirk. The hat gave it away. "Looks like you just stepped out of an old Western movie." For the first time, the man smiled. Not a full grin, just a slight curve of his lips. "Something like that," he said. Megan expected him to be annoyed, or at least defensive. But he wasn't. That only irritated her more. She was tired of being polite, tired of biting her tongue. "You know," she muttered, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret, "most people around here don't show up looking like they just came off a ranch." The man didn't answer immediately. He took a slow bite of his burger, chewing thoughtfully. Then, after a pause, he said, "I guess I'm not most people." His words were simple, yet they carried a weight Megan didn't expect. She felt a flicker of embarrassment, but quickly buried it. "Well, enjoy your meal," she said, pushing off the table before he could respond. She was certain she'd had the last word. Yet, as she cleared a nearby table, she felt his gaze on her. Not in a creepy way, but with a look that made her feel evaluated. Judged, even. It was unsettling. And she couldn't figure out why it bothered her so much. But something about that look would soon alter the course of her day and her life in ways she never imagined. The lunch rush slowed, and the restaurant grew quieter. Megan finally had a moment to breathe. She leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone while keeping an eye on her tables. Her gaze drifted to table 12, where the man was finishing his meal. He wasn't in a rush, sipping his water and casually glancing around the restaurant with quiet curiosity. "Hey, Megan," her coworker Danny said, passing by. "Isn't it weird how calm that guy is? Like he's just soaking it all in?" Megan shrugged. "Yeah, well, some people have all the time in the world." Danny chuckled. "Maybe he's famous or something. He looks familiar, doesn't he?" Megan rolled her eyes. Famous. Yeah, right. If he's famous, then I'm the Queen of England." Danny raised an eyebrow but didn't push the topic. Megan wasn't in the mood for silly theories. Instead, she grabbed the bill for table 12 and walked over, determined to make the exchange quick. "Here's your check," she said, placing it on the table with a polite but faint smile. "Whenever you're ready." The man glanced at the check but didn't pick it up immediately. Instead, he looked at her, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. "Do you enjoy your job?" he asked, his tone calm yet deliberate. The question caught Megan off guard. She hesitated, her practiced smile faltering. "It's fine," she said with a shrug. "It's a job, you know." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "A job is what you make of it," he said after a moment, "but it seems like you're carrying a lot today." Megan felt her cheeks warm. Who was he to comment on her attitude? She crossed her arms, defensive. "Look, I've had a rough shift, okay? Not everyone gets to sit around eating burgers and giving out life advice." To her surprise, the man didn't take offense. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. "Fair enough," he said. "But sometimes how you treat people in tough moments says more about you than you think." A flicker of irritation flared inside Megan. Was he seriously lecturing her? She opened her mouth to retort. But before she could, he stood up and pulled his wallet from his pocket. "I'll leave you with that thought," he said, placing a few bills on the table. "Thanks for the meal." As he walked toward the door, Megan muttered under her breath, "Yeah, whatever, cowboy." But just as he reached the exit, something unexpected happened. The manager, Carol, a sharp, no-nonsense woman, hurried out from her office, her face lighting up in recognition. "Mr. Eastwood." "I wasn't expecting you today," she said warmly, extending her hand. Megan froze. Her stomach dropped. She replayed the name in her mind. Eastwood. Clint Eastwood. Her head snapped toward the door, her eyes wide. She watched in stunned silence as the man turned back, shaking Carol's hand. Then, for the briefest moment, his eyes met Megan's. A knowing look passed between them. And then he walked out. Megan stood there frozen, her notepad clutched tightly in her hand. Clint Eastwood had just walked through that door. And she hadn't just been rude to him. She'd brushed off the owner of the restaurant. Her heart pounded as Carol turned to her. "Megan." Carol waved her over, beaming with excitement. "Can you believe it? Mr. Eastwood stopped by today. He's been so busy lately. I haven't seen him in weeks. Yeah, well, Megan stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Carl, oblivious to Megan's panic, kept talking. You know, this place means the world to him. He's involved in every detail. Everything here has his personal touch. That's why we always remind staff to be at their best. You never know when he'll stop by. Megan felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Her mind replayed every word she'd said to him, every sarcastic comment, every eye roll. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. Danny, noticing her pale face, frowned. Are you okay? I think I need a minute, Megan muttered, rushing to the break room. As soon as the door shut behind her, she let out a shaky breath and collapsed into a chair. How could she have been so oblivious? She'd worked at Sierra Grill for 2 years, but never once had she paid attention to the stories about the mysterious owner. If she had, maybe she would recognize him, or at least thought twice before running her mouth. Her mind spun, but one thought stood out. What now? What if Clint Eastwood told Carol about her attitude? She had no idea that he wasn't done with her just yet. The next day, Megan arrived at work, a tight knot of anxiety in her stomach. She hadn't slept well, replaying previous day over and over. Every time she thought about Clint Eastwood's calm demeanor, the way he had looked at her as he left, she cringed. What if he had told Carol? What if she got fired? She couldn't afford to lose this job, not with rent due in 2 weeks and student loans piling up. She spent the first half of her shift avoiding eye contact with Carol and doing everything possible to keep her customers happy. Smiling, apologizing, refilling drinks before anyone even had to ask. It was the most effort she'd put into her job in months. By the time lunch rolled around, the restaurant was buzzing with activity. Megan was wiping down a table when she heard that deep, gravelly voice. One she hadn't been able to forget. Well, looks like you're busy today. She turned quickly to see Clint Eastwood standing near the counter, his hands resting casually in his pockets. He was dressed the same as before, but this time his presence felt even more commanding. Her stomach twisted. She forced a nervous smile, scrambling for words. Mr. Eastwood, hi. I didn't know you'd be back so soon. He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. I like to check in on my places from time to time. Keeps everyone on their toes. Megan swallowed hard, her palms suddenly clammy. Right? Well, everything's running great today. He gave a small nod, then glanced around the restaurant. I see that, but you seem a little tense. She froze. Of course, he noticed. He probably noticed everything. About yesterday. He raised a hand, cutting her off. No need to apologize, he said, his voice calm. I'm not here to make your life harder. She blinked, caught off guard. You're not... No, he said evenly. But I do think there's a lesson here. He let a brief silence hang between them, his gaze steady. You never know who you're talking to, or what they might be going through. A little kindness goes a long way. Megan's throat tightened. She wasn't sure how to respond, so she just nodded, a lump forming in her chest. Look, I've had bad days too, Clint continued, his tone softening. But how you handle them says a lot about who you are. And trust me, people notice. She felt her face heat up. His words weren't harsh, but they struck deeper than any scolding ever could. He wasn't trying to humiliate her. He was trying to teach her something. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I mean it. He gave her a small smile. You're welcome. Just remember, every interaction is an opportunity. Use it well. With that, he tipped his hat and walked out, leaving Megan standing there, overwhelmed with emotions. For the first time in a long time, she felt something unexpected. The desire to be better. Over the next few weeks, Clint's words stuck with her. They replayed in her mind every time she stepped onto the restaurant floor. Every interaction an opportunity. Use it well. At first, she wasn't sure how to change. She wasn't the type to fake a bright smile or gush over customers like some of her coworkers. But Clint's calm demeanor and quiet wisdom had struck a chord. She didn't have to pretend to be someone else. She just needed to show a little more patience, a little more care. So she started small. When a stressed-out mom with 3 kids knocked over a soda, Megan didn't sigh or roll her eyes. She grabbed a rag, smiled, and said, "Don't worry, it happens to the best of us." When an elderly couple asked her to repeat the specials 3 times, she didn't let her frustration show. She explained them patiently, even adding her own recommendations. And the most surprising part? The more effort she put into treating people kindly, the better she felt. One evening, near the end of her shift, Carol called Megan into the office. Megan's stomach twisted with nerves as she stepped inside, bracing for the worst. "You've been here a while," Carol said, folding her hands on the desk. "And I've noticed a change in you lately. A good one." Megan blinked, unsure how to respond. "Oh, thank you. I don't know what brought it on," Carol continued. "But whatever you're doing, keep it up. The customers have noticed, too. One of them even left a comment card praising your service." Megan felt a swell of pride and disbelief. She hadn't expected anyone to notice her efforts, let alone acknowledge them. As she left the office, a small smile tugged at her lips. She still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. That night, as she locked up the restaurant, her eyes flicked to the sign out front. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a place where she could grow, learn, and maybe even make a difference. And she owed it all to the quiet cowboy who had walked in on a busy afternoon and taught her a lesson she'd never forget. Because sometimes the smallest interactions have the biggest impact, and every moment is a chance to become someone better. If this story inspired you, hit the like button and share it with someone who could use a little encouragement. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life lessons and stories that remind us all to be a little kinder every day.